Hi, I'm the Domestic Feminist. I'm a working married mother of 3, and I like to talk about the everyday challenges women face in the home front from a feminist perspective. Today, I want to talk about androcentric language. As you might guess from the root andro, which means man, androcentric language means language centered around men. But how could that be? I mean, women speak with each other all the time using language, and we do just fine, right? Mostly yes, but there are times when we go through something difficult and the words fail us. Take postpartum depression. The term is fairly recent, so what did women call what they were feeling a century ago? Imagine how that must have felt, how wrong it must have seemed to them to feel as they did when they just brought life into the world and into a world that did not concern itself much with women. Musician Annie Clark, known professionally as St. Vincent, captures something that is hard to find the words to really express about the female experience. In the songs Cruel and Cheerleader, along with their videos, she captures something missing from public discourse. These two songs seem to be talking about the expectations on women to do what is broadly called emotional labor. What is that? That question is at least a video in and of itself, but the term in its original form was about paid work, where the employee was expected to create a feeling in others. For example, customer service making a customer feel good about their experience, or to feel a particular feeling of themselves in order for them to do their job. This can take the form of trying not to be bothered with how you are treated, with advice like, "Don't let them get you down." Even though Arlie Hochschild, the creator of the term, was concerned about the sociological impacts of jobs that require this, feminists recognized that it was something that also explained a lot of what women are expected to do, while also not being recognized for it. Since Hochschild coined the term, it has been used broadly to describe any number of unrealistic or unfair expectations placed on women in their personal lives. And now it is getting to the point where it is difficult to say exactly what emotional labor is. Again, I could spend at least a whole video on it, but for the purposes of discussing androcentric language, emotional labor is the perfect example about how the dearth of words in our language fail to truly convey the female experience. So much so that when a new term comes along that fills a particular void, we get carried away and use it so broadly, which leads to confusion, concept creep, or the term losing its meaning. Another example of a word trying to fill shoes made way too big is by the lack of experience of women in language is the word hysteria. This word has a long history. It comes from the Greek word for uterus, but it was the Egyptians back in 1900 BCE that first came up with a theory that inexplicable and unwanted behavior in women was due to a wandering uterus. The Greeks added the inability to bear children, or failure to marry, on the definition, and the Romans used the term hysteria to explain miscarriages or menopause. A Greek doctor in the Roman Empire, Galen, was the first to theorize that hysteria was due to sexual deprivation and recommended pelvic massage to create hysterical paroxysm, in other words, an orgasm. Then St. Augustine's teachings on human suffering being the result of sin claimed that hysteria was satanic possession. Then in the 16th and 17th centuries, scientists saw it was a neurological condition which paved the way in the 18th century to see it as a mental disorder. In the 19th century, efforts were made to automate the practice of pelvic massage, and early in the 20th century, affordable portable ones, known today as vibrators, became widely available to women to use in private. Yes, as shocking as it is to hear that for centuries doctors have been treating hysteria with manual stimulation to give women orgasms, let's be clear that the doctors did not see it as sexual. They saw it as a nuisance. A lucrative nuisance, yes, but because it was dealing with women and their private parts, it was seen as beneath the doctors. How could that be? Doctors giving women orgasms and not seeing it as sexual? But that is the point. Androcentric language leaves little room for women in the things we experience, creating a schism in sexual activity between men and women. Because during that time, sex was simply a man penetrating a woman until he climaxes, it totally left out what that meant for women, that women were incredibly sexually frustrated. Isn't that funny how, in the traditional telling of history, we never question the narrative that sex back then was simply for male pleasure and reproduction? End of story. And so, androcentric language created an odd loophole where even though they were living through times where they were not supposed to experience sexual pleasure, women were getting sexual relief from their doctors and later from vibrators advertised in proper ladies' magazines. But apart from the odd sexual aspect to hysteria, this also shows a troubling tendency for society, after denying women's needs, sexual, emotional testimonial for so long, to deal with the mess it creates by lumping all female-related issues with a catch-all term. A term that is farther along in the public's understanding is sexual assault. In 1977, philosopher Michel Foucault said that there really was no such thing. In his mind, the only way this could be the case was if a woman was physically assaulted while doing a sexual act. And in his opinion, this should simply be charged as assault, not as a sexual act. Nowadays, we recognize sexual assault for the complex, awful thing that it is, and it is not something limited to physical violence leaving cuts and bruises. Take Soraya Chemaly's great-grandmother, whom Chemaly spoke about in her Credibility Gap talk and wrote about in her book Rage Becomes Her. She describes her great-grandmother sitting on her front porch, no longer able to speak. Her family used to say, oh, she lost her mind, but Chemaly sees it differently. There is a supposedly romantic story that was repeatedly told of her great-grandparents.
When she was 14, the beautiful girl, and it always started that way because why else would this happen? The beautiful girl was walking in her village, and a handsome man on a horse rode in, swept her off her feet, made her his wife. That's a euphemism, right? And off they went, traveled the world and had 7 children, and here we all are today.
Chemaly knew, even as a kid, that that was wrong and that he should be punished for it. But the family, having been created as a result of this kidnapping and forced marriage and being immersed in a culture that romanticizes such unions, also lacked the words to see it for what it was. Chemaly, as an adult thinking back about her great-grandmother sitting silently in her rocking chair on the veranda, does not think she lost her mind. Or if she did, not in the way we assume. Instead, Chemaly sees her as having lived an incomprehensible life. How many of us are out there living an incomprehensible life, about to lose our mind because we don't have the words to describe our experience, and so we really do not have a voice. Androcentric language is not only about words missing from our language to describe our experience, it is also in our sentence structure. Jackson Katz, in his TEDx talk, Violence Against Women, It's a Men's Issue, demonstrates how our language structure takes the focus off of men and puts it on women, making blaming the victim inevitable.
This comes from the work of the feminist linguist Julia Penelope. It starts with a very basic English sentence. John beat Mary. That's a good English sentence. John is the subject, beat is the verb, Mary is the object. Good sentence. Now we're going to move to the second sentence, which says the same thing in the passive voice. Mary was beaten by John, and now a whole lot has happened in one sentence. We've gone from John beat Mary to Mary was beaten by John. We've shifted our focus in one sentence from John to Mary. And you can see John is very close to the end of the sentence, well, close to dropping off the map of our psychic plane. The third sentence, John is dropped, and we have Mary was beaten, and now it's all about Mary. We're not even thinking about John. It's totally focused on Mary. Over the past generation, the term we've used synonymous with beaten is battered, so we have Mary was battered. And the final sentence in this sequence, flowing from the others, is Mary is a battered woman. So now Mary's very identity, Mary is a battered woman, is what was done to her by John in the first instance. But we've demonstrated that John has long ago left the conversation. Now, those of us who work in domestic and sexual violence field know that victim blaming is pervasive in this realm, which is to say blaming the person to whom something was done rather than the person who did it. And we say things like, why do these women go out with these men? Why are they attracted to these men? Why do they keep going back? What was she wearing at that party? What a stupid thing to do. Why was she drinking with that group of guys in that hotel room? This is victim blaming. And there are numerous reasons for it, but one of them is that our whole cognitive structure is set up to blame victims. This is all unconscious. Our whole cognitive structure is set up to ask questions about women and women's choices and what they're doing, thinking, and wearing. And I'm not going to shout down people who ask questions about women. Okay, it's a legitimate thing to ask. But let's be clear, asking questions about Mary is not going to get us anywhere in terms of preventing violence. We have to ask a different set of questions. And you can see where I'm going with this, right? The questions are not about Mary, they're about John.
And the structure of humor also does its part to keep the full story of what women experience from being told, reducing trauma to a punchline for a laugh. Comedian Hannah Gadsby exposes this brilliantly in her Netflix comedy special, Nanette. What other injustices is our language keeping in place? So what can we do about it? Feminists have been working on this for a long time now, and their hard work has made some headway. Here are just a few terms that have helped make more space for women in our language, and by extension, our society's understanding of us. Here's another way to develop a more female-friendly understanding of ourselves and the world. Look at art. Here are a few female artists to check out. Artemisia Gentileschi. Gentileschi created this version of Susanna and the Elders, where the men give her the choice of sleeping with them or being publicly shamed and humiliated before getting stoned to death. Unlike the many other depictions of Susanna and the Elders done by men, where the artist highlights the power dynamic, Gentileschi shows Susanna's disgust. Seeing a painting like this really shows how one-sided stories like this have been, where the subject is not the wrongness of what is happening, but instead is about a vulnerable, terrified woman begging for mercy, often for the male viewer's prurient pleasure. How different would things be if more paintings of this existed, where women depict women's experience? Frida Kahlo. Mexican surrealist painter Frida Kahlo is most known for her stoic self-portraits enduring pain and loss. Kahlo is unapologetic about depicting taboo female subjects like pregnancy loss, domestic abuse, and gender identity. It is remarkable what Kahlo endured during her lifetime: polio causing a permanent limp, a bus accident for which she was impaled, for which she underwent over 30 surgeries and 2 unwanted abortions because otherwise she would not survive, and a passionate but painful marriage where her husband slept with many, many women, including her sister. Her art is not limited to depicting painful subjects, but perhaps she is most famous for it because she's speaking about the inner lives of women in a way that simply had not been seen before. Kara Walker. Kara Walker explores the difficult subject of America struggling as a post-slavery society. In particular, she breaks ground with how racism shows up in interracial relationships in her silhouette murals. Her giant sugar sphinx shows the direct link between sugar and slavery. When challenged about the insensitivity of her work for other Black Americans, she more or less agrees, but says, "I'm older now, but I really lacked empathy in a way I did not realize. Desensitized, not fully grasping the positivity of Black life, and looking more closely at cruel Native spaces. But I do that because I've lived in that space quite a lot." Another Black artist, Betty Saar, actually campaigned to have Walker's work banned because she saw it as sexist, racist, and exploitive. Rather than the work exploiting painful Black history for its sensational elements, however, Walker was creating work that explored being objectified and being an object of white male desire, and in particular, a toxic relationship she had with a white man that her therapist had said created a schizoid reaction in Walker. I have for years been overcoming the vast mythology I constructed around him, certain that to acknowledge him publicly would mean my imminent death. As I think I have alternately suggested, he's a sadist, a racist, a misogynist, and perhaps less credibly, Satan himself. It is true, I learned a lot during that time, but all of it couched in silence and in a deep sense of terror. I was to him an enigma, and there was no love lost. Walker is an important Black female voice in helping us understand racism, violence against women, and the unresolved legacy of slavery playing out in people's lives. These are just a few artists to check out to get you started. Feel free to add others in the comments. I mentioned St. Vincent earlier. If you're not familiar with her already, listen and watch Cruel and Cheerleader, and notice the feelings it creates in you. See what words get stirred up. If you're so inclined, write poetry or create art around these feelings. The more we look to art, music, and poetry to explore our experience, the more we'll be able to create more words to capture it and delve deeper into how to create a more just and kind world. Thanks for watching. I hope this is helpful to you. If so, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Your comments also help one another continue the discussion. Below in the show notes are resources that I mentioned in this video for further study. Have a great day.
I've played dumb.